Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Maybell Romero, Assistant Professor of Law at the Northern Illinois University College of Law and Ipsa Dixit co-host. We will discuss her draft article, Prosecutors and Police, an Unholy Union. So, podcaster podcasted. Welcome to the show, Maybell.
Thanks so much. I have to admit, a different experience being on the other end of the questions.
Okay. So you sent me this draft earlier today, and I was like, what the fuck, right? Merger of police and prosecutor unions. Okay, number one, what? Number two, what? Like prosecutor union? What is this?
I appreciate that we can all admit here that this is a giant what the fuck moment. You know, I'm like, okay, maybe this is like Ipsy Dixit after dark here saying that. But, you know, prosecutors generally have not historically involved themselves in labor unions. There have been prosecutorial associations, prosecutorial like employment, affiliations and the like, but they have yet really to commonly, formally unionize. And what you see recently in response to reformist prosecutors, specifically in St. Louis, is prosecutors who are joining into formalized labor unions with the police, which I find absolutely terrifying given that, police unions have really been these, strong walls against criminal justice reform. The last thing I want to see is prosecutors really hooking up in that sort of environment and in that sort of alliance with police even more strongly than they are now.
Okay, so obviously I want to come back to learn more about what's going on in St. Louis and sort of the reaction to the progressive prosecutor movement more generally. But I wonder if you could start by talking a little bit about the kind of nature and history of police unions. I mean, sort of like, when did the police start to sort of professionalize or unionize in this way?
Okay, so the history of police unions is actually a really interesting thing. And, you've got to look back at the history of just public sector unions in the first place. Public sector unions have a little bit of a different footing and a little bit of a different background than private sector unions. So what you see is that in the US, private sector unions started developing, in the 1800s or so. Whereas public sector unions, they only, really start coming into their own into, the 1900s. And one of the first public sector unions out there was actually a police union, or at least a police union, a bunch of police trying to unionize. They were actually attempting to join this larger union called the American Federation of Labor in the early 1900s, in 1919, actually. And this was in Massachusetts, specifically in Boston. And, these police back then, they actually had a long list of very understandable problems with their bosses and with the management. And, the governor actually controlled policing in Boston back then. It was set up in such a way that, they wouldn't take their grievances to the mayor, it would go to the governor. So, these policemen back then, they worked really long hours, they had really terrible pay. Sometimes they weren't even allowed to leave the city. So they had these really strange restrictions on their movement. They enjoyed not enjoyed, but they were burdened with no personal time off, essentially. So they tried to join the American Federation of Labor at that point to try to get better working conditions, like, a normal union would. And these officers all went on strike. A little over 70% of them just didn't show up to work on one day. And what you see is that the governor back then, Calvin Coolidge, ended up really disparaging them, saying, hey, you guys are traitors, you guys are communists, throwing a label of being Bolshevists at them or something like that. And doing that really set back public sentiment, not just on police unions, but also public sector unions in the first place. And to some extent, I feel like you see that as sort of a trope in the United States from then on, sort of these sorts of Red Scare tactics, like, oh, this is Bolshevism, this is communism, and, the populists freaks out and they're very upset about it. So this strike that the police went on in September of 1919 in Boston really set back a lot of the momentum that public sector unions had going. And it really, you really don't see police unions or a lot of like public sector unions coming into their own until the 1970s after that. So it really did slow the momentum. And what you see is that, police themselves haven't even been unionizing for all that long. So we're still trying to figure out to some extent, how much power should these unions have? To what extent should they be able to really influence public policy? Because they're relatively young compared to private sector unions.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting dynamic, it seems like, in the sense that, at one point in time, sort of pre-war and part of post-war America, private unions were kind of the dominant, if not the only, sort of unionized labor force in the United States. But today, to the extent we have unionized labor forces, still the public sector unions are far and away, at least by my understanding, the largest segment of the unionized labor force in America. So I wonder, what do you think about the relationship between public sector unions and private sector unions? Or more specifically, like, what do you think about the relationship between police unions and other kinds of public sector unions? I mean, is there something unique about police unions and the way that they work and the way that they kind of came into existence and govern or manage themselves that in any way makes them different from other kinds of unions?
I mean, I think what's really interesting is that when you look at sort of the purpose of the police and just, the history of policing, period, you don't necessarily think of police as necessarily being worker friendly in that sense. Police officers, they enjoy much more robust protections already than, their private sector sort of counterparts. So, they have much more in the way of freedoms of exercising First Amendment rights. They're shielded from retaliation in the workplace and everything. They enjoy much nicer protections that way, much more robust protections. But even, just historically, what you see is that, in the early 1800s, when you see private sector workers trying to unionize, if informally, they didn't necessarily, have sort of the same, labor movement vocabulary back then. They tried to get together and protest and picket for better wages and stuff like that. They would actually get harassed by the police and they would get prosecuted for conspiracy, actually. So what you saw was that the police were actually very opposed to, private sector union activity. The police also, they worked together to undermine the gains that, formerly enslaved Black people made after the Civil War in particular. So what I find really interesting about police and unionizing is that historically the police have been rather at odds with, those populations that we might think of as being more aligned with labor unions in that sense. So, there's this alignment between law enforcement and, management and everything against poor laborers. And in that sense, I think the role of the police union is very different from, a normal union. It's always been, the police have always been oppositional to workers and their concerns, I think.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that struck me really quite strongly in your paper was that, like, one of the initial arguments against the police being able to unionize, and specifically being able to unionize in the context of the AFL, was that, it's like, well, the job of the police is to be around to break up the strikes when the laborers start agitating. It's like, and to some extent, that's still true, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, they're here to like bash heads together, break up these protests. They're here to protect property. They're here to protect business. So, I think that there's a very sort of different footing that police unions start up because of that history.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I wonder if as well you could talk a little bit about the relationship between police unionization and accountability. Because I think it's no secret that there's some tension there. And I think that obviously, as you point out in your paper, that historical tensions in that area ought to inform how we think about sort of prospective efforts toward unionization by police, and especially police in concert with prosecutors.
And that's what's sort of problematic, I think, about the police union in particular, because like I was saying earlier, their unionization efforts really did start with sort of the concerns that you would see in probably any other labor union: poor wages, poor working conditions, poor hours, and the like. Um, but to some extent, what you see is that these police unions, in trying to improve working conditions and trying to, I'd argue, make the job a bit easier, they really form this bulwark against criminal justice reform, in that they offer this shield against accountability. They end up lobbying for different protections for police officers, even when it comes to police officers who use deadly force or excessive force. These police officers who do something wrong are able to hide behind their union, and they have the full support of their union, oftentimes. So I think a lot of communities have started to see, well, not even started, but have gotten to know police unions. Rather, they're not necessarily, these organizations fight against poverty and fighting for better wages for everyone else, as like brothers in labor or something like that, so much as, this sort of gang almost of police officers who are there to support each other and there to really give each other cover for their misdeeds. And that's a bit of the problem that I have when it comes to prosecutors also joining into police unions, or even forming more close relationships with them. I don't want to see even more cover for prosecutors who engage in misconduct. There already is enough as it is.
Well, maybe you could talk a little bit about the kind of historical relationship between prosecutors and police. Like, sort of how is that relationship developed over time? I mean, were they always closely connected, or have there been kind of tensions or differences or sort of different incentives in relation to prosecutors and police?
I mean, that's what's sort of interesting about the relationship between the two. In the paper, I cite to this, DOJ newsletter from the 1970s, bemoaning the fact that prosecutors and police do not work well together and that they're not very close. So I think there used to be much more of it appears to me at least, there used to be much more of a sort of hands-off and distant relationship between the two. The police oftentimes are seen as being kind of these working class folks, whereas prosecutors were, of course, overeducated attorneys like you and me, I guess. And because of that, they were rather, opposed to each other class-wise and everything, and had very different backgrounds. But I think as you'd see in like the 1930s and everything, what with the rise of organized crime, and just with the rise of more federal and state crimes, you'd see penal codes proliferate and kind of, the different things that were outlawed, as crimes kind of multiplied like tribbles from Star Trek, where it's like you can't get them to stop. There's an opportunity for both of these organizations, both police and prosecutors, to work together to really, I think, build each other's power at that point. And you start seeing them, coming closer together and closer together in the way that they interact and the way that they work, and even the way that they lobby in particular. And I cover that to some extent in the paper when it comes to elections and political lobbying and trying to get certain laws that are favorable for both prosecutors and police passed.
I mean, it seems like, based on my reading of your paper, at least part of the incentive for police unionization, it sounds like part of it was kind of traditional labor issues, but it seems like at least part of the incentive for unionization was to better protect police officers against measures to increase accountability for them.
Exactly.
And it seems to me, again, based on my reading of your paper, that, right now we're seeing this move, at least in some primarily urban centers, toward what people have referred to as kind of progressive prosecutors and sort of rethinking the role of the prosecutor and increasing accountability of prosecutors. I wonder if you could talk about sort of what the progressive prosecutor movement is, where it's coming from, and how kind of rank and file prosecutors are reacting to political figures coming in with these new priorities.
I'm heartened by seeing this progressive prosecutor movement, even though I'm not exactly into the label as such. I would argue that you can't necessarily be progressive and a prosecutor just by the nature of the job itself. But, for purposes of this interview and even for the paper, that's neither here nor there. I call them reformist prosecutors. Some people call them progressive prosecutors. Some people refer to them as being less carceral. I think we're all referring to the same thing to some extent. It's something that, prosecutors are at least making some sort of moves away from the status quo. And you do see these prosecutors proliferating a bit more in your large urban centers, which is an exciting thing to see. Recently with Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Tiffany Caban, who almost won her election in Queens. These prosecutors who are making these big inroads, promising less mass incarceration, prosecuting not prosecuting nonviolent, folks generally, having more of a concern for their communities rather than locking people up all the time. And what you see is that with some rank and file prosecutors, that has really upset them to a great extent. There's been a lot of work done with regard to what prosecutors are motivated by in particular, what they identify with. And oftentimes what you see is that prosecutors, they have much more of a personal identification with their jobs than other lawyers do. Even more than, big firm lawyers or even public defenders. They feel like they are the good guys, that they're putting bad guys away, almost sort of like this superhero complex, I think. And what they see is that when they have a progressive prosecutor stepping into a leadership role, they get very upset. And for example, in St. Louis, what you saw was that a number of prosecutors ended up resigning. They just didn't want to work for a progressive prosecutor, in this case, Wesley Bell. Or, they end up getting closer with police and getting tighter with police and wanting to unionize with the police such that they can enjoy those same sorts of protections and that same sort of umbrella against, I'd argue, accountability that the police get to enjoy. So it's really interesting to see this tension between line prosecutors and elected prosecutors and this really big gulf between what both sides think they should be doing and what's really, their job.
Yeah, well, I mean, with Black Lives Matter and all other kinds of sort of progressive movements thinking about incarceration and the role of the state in policing various kinds of, activity, there's been a real concern about, at least as far as I've seen, like police unions sort of protecting abusive officers and so on. I mean, to what extent is that a concern, do you think, that prosecutors are feeling in relation to this sort of shift in priorities in the kind of the people running, the kind of political people running the prosecutors' offices? I mean, do you see that same kind of concern about protecting people from accountability? And to what extent do we have, or should we have, concerns about accountability among prosecutors?
I mean, I think we should have really big concerns about accountability among prosecutors in that, there are already very few mechanisms by which to punish the wayward prosecutor, by which to really correct what they do if they do something wrong. You see, at least from both the ABA and the National District Attorneys Association, they have these rules that they promulgate with regard to standards for the prosecution function that are admittedly from both organizations aspirational at best. So what you see is that, the prosecutor is given a lot of discretion, a lot of free rein to essentially do what they want. Oftentimes not really having to pay for it in any way unless someone could actually prove that, yes, they are engaging in some sort of, intentional malfeasance, which is always very difficult to do. But, I think that we should be really concerned in that, you can find lots of examples of prosecutors who really try to duck accountability. They try to cover up for other people. In the paper, in particular, I look at two very recent law school graduates from St. Louis, once again, who actually covered up an incident where a police officer rather savagely beat a suspect. This was a suspect that was caught with the officer's daughter's stolen credit card. The suspect said that he had found it on the sidewalk or something like that, which is pretty plausible. Stuff like that happens. But this police officer, really severely beat this poor man and ended up joking about it on a conference call with some of these prosecutors, who then ended up covering up the details of the incident and not admitting it to, supervisors. And they let this poor suspect get charged with fleeing the scene or fleeing from an officer, even though that had never happened. So, I know that a lot of these stories, of course, they're anecdotal, but when we have such a localized criminal justice system throughout the United States, it's very difficult to collect massive amounts of data. But, I think just even seeing these examples shows us how things can go wrong, shows us the risk of these close relationships between prosecutors and police, and really, it demonstrates for us why we should be really concerned about prosecutors and police working together so closely.
Well, in your paper, you have this great quote from Justice Jackson, where he says, "The qualities of a good prosecutor are as elusive and impossible to define as those of mark a gentleman, and those who need to be told would not understand it anyway. A sensitiveness to fair play and sportsmanship is perhaps the best protection against the abuse of power. And the citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor who tempers zeal with human kindness, who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches his task with humility." And that, really, that strikes me as like the 1940s equivalent of saying what we need is progressive prosecutors. And
Right.
That's what prosecutors should be like. To what extent does the sort of backlash among prosecutors against the kind of progressive prosecutor or reformist prosecutor movement reflect a sort of lack of acceptance of that sort of professional ethical model of what the prosecutor's role is?
I think it shows a great lack of acceptance, in this sort of perpetual denial as to what I argue they should be doing. And, I think Justice Jackson would actually agree with me on this, where, you are supposed to be sensitive to fair play. You are supposed to be, a minister of justice and not necessarily just trying to, score notches on a belt where you're convicting people and locking them up. But what you see is that so many prosecutors get so caught up, I think, in this really strange culture where, they're putting away bad guys. They're the good guys. They're the ones who win, and they're used to winning all the time. It makes me think of a story that a friend related to me in Oklahoma in particular, where every time someone would win a jury trial, they would get, I think, a small little figurine of like a bulldog or something like that, like some ridiculous little trial bulldog that they would display in their office. And then after they got a certain number of those, they got like a really large one. It's almost like playing skee ball or something like that. Like, once I amass this number, then I could trade this in for a bigger prize. And I think there's a really big sort of denial amongst prosecutors that it's like, look, if you're engaging this sort of behavior, no, you are not the good guy. You're really doing this, due to your own personal motivations, really aggrandizing yourself and sort of buying into this idea that, hey, my job is to convict people and put them away, and that's what I'm here for. And if you look at what even just the standards that the NDAA promulgates, the National District Attorneys Association is this large, essentially a lobbying group for prosecutors. It's headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia. And part of what they do is they not only do they lobby, but they also promulgate rules for prosecutors to follow. And oftentimes these rules run very counter to the ABA model rules and the ABA rules for the prosecution function. And this happens because these prosecutors with the NDAA, they actually believe that the ABA is a left-wing lobbying organization. They've said this, and that no one in the ABA can possibly understand what it's like to be a prosecutor. So again, prosecutors strongly identify with their jobs. They think that they're very special. They think that no one else could possibly understand what it's like to be them. So I think this strange sort of insular culture is something that we really need to be leery of, that we need to figure out how to dismantle, that we really need to figure out how to fight against.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me that it seems at least possible that this increasing, as it seems, solidarity of police and prosecutors, to the point of prosecutors sort of wanting to unionize in conjunction with police unions, maybe like isn't so much necessarily the problem itself, so much as reflective of an underlying shift in the way that the kind of prosecutors and our justice system writ large thinks of its role in relation to the prosecution of criminal justice. In a sense, like it almost seems like the rank and file are rebelling against the supposed sort of political representatives who are at least in theory telling them what to do.
Absolutely, I agree. And I had to chuckle to myself when were talking about this solidarity, because when I think of solidarity, I think of something very different. That it signifies to me. Like real labor unions and everything, and real solidarity between people who have been historically underrepresented or abused essentially economically. But I think we have to start getting ready to see this backlash. And I really do think that these efforts toward unionization with, police, or even any other sort of tighter relationship with them, it's very much a symptom, like you said, not necessarily the problem. I'm not even necessarily saying that, okay, police unions in and of themselves are so bad, or that prosecutor unions are in and of themselves so bad. If they were focusing on normal labor union concerns, things like long hours, working conditions, stuff like that. The problem is that what you see is that they're being used as a mechanism to flummox criminal justice reform. For example, in California, police and labor unions came together. Police and prosecutor unions, excuse me. They came together to try to stop the passage of a law that would get rid of the felony murder rule, for example. I think that goes beyond the purview of what you should be doing as a labor union. That's more just looking at criminal law doctrine and trying to influence that for the entire state. So that's more of what I have a problem with these relationships that are getting more and more entangled and more entrenched.
Mm-hmm. Well, so in closing, Maybell, for people who are invested in and care about criminal justice reform, what should we think about this development, and what should we do about it? I mean, it seems like in some ways the increasing unionization is more of a symptom than a cause. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what people should do with that. Like, how should we think about this symptom, and what's the solution?
And I appreciate you really looking at this as sort of a symptom of perhaps a larger illness here, in that I think there really are some very serious cultural concerns that we should have with regard to what's going on in prosecutors' offices and police officers, and how they're interrelating with each other. I really do envision a very different role for the prosecutor based on what the ABA sort of envisions a prosecutor to be, a minister of justice, or what, that quote that we were talking about with from Justice Jackson, where, prosecutors should really be much more concerned with doing justice for their communities and doing justice for their constituents. And, something that my paper looks at is sort of a public health approach to prosecutorial culture change, as a potential intervention. And I think, prosecutors, if you hear some oinking in the background, that's my Boston Terrier, Mo. So excuse me. Prosecutors, again, they think themselves as being very special and very unique. And there's another industry, another sort of group of people who have historically thought this, and those are physicians. They have been known historically to think of themselves as self-important and being self-righteous. And that has occasionally, at least in the medical field, also led to poor judgment calls and error and misconduct. So what's interesting is that there has been a really big public health push to fight against what's termed this normalization of deviance. And this normalization of deviance meaning when maybe when someone or a group of people in an organization does something wrong, it's sort of like, that's sort of normal. We're used to that. That's what happens. These are the shortcuts you take and the like. But that's not okay to have that happen. We shouldn't be so success oriented. If you're a prosecutor, that might translate into not being as oriented toward getting convictions or winning trials or something like that. And something that we could really look at doing, I think, is trying to change the culture in sort of the way that the medical field has when it comes to how prosecutors work together and how prosecutors work with other people in their offices, like, legal assistants and paralegals and everything, coming together and reviewing periodically where some things went wrong, where maybe some, ethical near misses may have happened and how to prevent that in the future. And having prosecutors stop really identifying with their roles as much and actually admitting that, yes, we're humans. Sometimes we make mistakes. How do we actually move on from that and learn to be better? So I think there's a lot to learn from different industries, particularly the medical field. And, hopefully I have the chance to come back and talk about that a little bit later with a future draft, looking at that more in depth.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Maybell. It's always a pleasure to hear your voice on the quote unquote radio. And I think Mo deserves a treat.
I think he does too. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Hanging around, fooling about, sure get you down, sure get you down, sure get you down. Hanging around and fooling about, sure get you down. If you hang around and fooling about too long, police and high-tide coming riding down, riding down, riding down. Police and high-tide coming riding down, and you know you don't want to go. Hanging around the skin jam, sure get you down, sure get you down. Hanging around the skin jam, sure get you down. If you hang around the skin jam too long, police and high-tide coming riding down, riding down, riding down. Police and high-tide coming riding down, and you know you don't want to go. 30 days in the jailhouse will sure get you down, sure get you down. 30 days in the jailhouse will sure get you down. If you stay in the jailhouse too long, God's in the roadside will come carry you down, carry you down. God's in the road rider come and carry you down, and you know you don't want to God.